So then McLuhan goes on to say that such temporary bridges are necessary today not only between cultures but within our own culture with respect to building bridges between the different media to understand them, because one of the problems we have is that as a print-based culture, because we have been locked in 4 centuries of a print-based culture, we have an unconscious bias to try to understand all new media in terms of old rectilinear patterns of thinking. And this blocks our ability, it gives us a bias, a printed book bias that blocks our ability to see the media for how and what they are and the way that they function in different ways. This is an example of what McLuhan will later call the rear view mirror effect, which is how we attempt to understand a new medium through the form language of an older medium. For example, when the automobile came about, it was first called the horseless carriage, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. It is not a horseless carriage at all. It's a completely new medium. Or when the railroad first came into being, it was called the iron horse, by analogy with a previous mode of transportation, when of course it's nothing of the sort. So we have this tendency to understand new media in terms of what we've learned about past media, and that often blinds us to seeing what the potentialities are of the new media. So he's saying there's a bias here that he himself now is trying to overcome. This may not be so much true any longer because we're living here 50, 60 years later in a post-McLuhan world where we've metabolized and absorbed a lot of this. But back in this day, in the 1950s, early mid-50s, what McLuhan was saying was radically new stuff. This was new avant-garde stuff, and it took him a while to get an audience for this type of thing. He says, too, that there is also this bias in America in favor of the book. This is 1953. You can see how much things have changed even since the 50s. This bias in favor of the book prevents things like, he said, at the University of Utah, they recorded the conversation between Dylan Thomas and members and students in the English department, and they recorded the conversation, and he says that the recording of the conversation is actually worth more than tomes of critical analysis on Dylan Thomas, because you have him, jazzing. He's informal, he's dropping these anecdotes and private conversations, private anecdotes. All this conversation stuff that got recorded reveals a facet of the artist that tended, at this time anyway, not to be something that Americans tended to favor. But he says Europeans, on the other hand, with their holdover from the oral residue of the manuscript tradition, are perfectly comfortable with this and love anecdotes about the artist and off-the-cuff remarks, the chance remark, and the first acquaintance with the artist, and so forth. So he says here they expect to see the mind of the artist in spontaneous action in Europe, just as they seek in conversation to awaken and rally creative sources. And then he says, in this regard, though, the paperback, which was a new medium that came into being during World War II, and it was a brand new medium, he says the paperback can help to efface some of this bias against, and there was in these days in America a very strong bias against intellectualism and against seeing the individual. There's a very strong work ethic in the American tradition, and anyone who is seen reading books is immediately written off as an intellectual and is seen as effete and effeminate and indolent and lazy and wasting his time. He says one of the things that the paperback did was that it made portable this interface of the individual with the book in such a way that it began to remove the hex of the cultural boogie of the book, to get rid of it and put a hex on it and make it seem a little more socially acceptable. As he says, Mr. Delmore Schwartz had pointed out that at college people read books and promoted a habit of communication thereby, learning, and then later they gave up books because it interfered with normal social life. But he says that with the paperback, one can return to this solitary vice without interfering with one's social acceptability. Then he concludes the essay by saying that the habitual contemplation of the media of communication as art forms necessarily invokes the principle that the instruments of research are themselves also art forms, magically distorting and controlling the objects of investigation. So it's important to become aware of the biases. Whatever your medium is, whether you're a scientist or a researcher, you need to know what biases that you're bringing to your study with you, because they're going to change the results. This is well known as the uncertainty principle, of course, in physics. It's an old idea, but it was new at the time that McLuhan was introducing it here into media studies. And he says that we need then to come up with a discourse and a vocabulary that will be capable of unearthing these biases so that we can understand how the media themselves change the content of what goes through them, and we can therefore begin to build a new discipline of media studies. So we can see then that with this essay, McLuhan creates his basic thesis that the medium is the message, which is a thesis that's meant to counter the bias, the cliche, that communication is simply about the transmission of information and that the medium is neutral. Doesn't matter what medium you put the signal through, it doesn't change it. That's the cliche that McLuhan's trying to counter here with this next idea. And so we'll stop there with that essay and then move on next to the next essay.